My understanding is that this is the first affordable housing funding that the county has ever asked or put into place. Whatever they estimate in good faith that they will raise, let's say $5 million a year or whatever it ends up being, anything over than that, they actually have to return to nicotine product distributors. And what Prop I is doing is essentially saying, what if we ask the voters, if we can just keep any additional money raised by these taxes and not have to ask about retaining that money for the purpose that we already told you and we all agreed we should do. Buying up all this land and preserving it has greatly increased property value. So why aren't we doing any property tax for this? I don't think there's a single amount of open space that's directly funded by property tax. I think that's a very fair question.
Hello, Boulder and the wider world. This is the Sharing Boulder podcast. My name is Philip Ogren, and for episode 47, I spoke with Eric Budd, who is a political activist and organizer who has been involved in various issues such as occupancy reform, even-year elections, and advocacy for cycling. He is also involved in various organizations including Boulder Progressives, Better Boulder, Boulder Housing Coalition, and Community Cycles, among others. In 2016, Eric started writing an annual voter's guide that he distributes widely around the city to help inform voters and promote his progressive values. These guides are rich with background information, links to relevant resources, and detailed commentary about the whys and whats of the various items on the ballot. We met at Park East Park and talked about the joys of mail-in voting, why Eric started his voter's guide, and then discussed the 7 ballot measures that City of Boulder voters will see on their ballots. 2 state measures, 2 county measures, and 3 city measures. We had ambitions to discuss the candidates too, but we ran out of time. I hope you enjoyed this deep dive into the 2023 ballot measures with Eric Budd.
Starfish here, now we're having a good party, talking about structural change. We believe the land is sacred, even beneath that vacant parking lot, where the weeds are doing their best to express the need for something different. Gonna make some space for you and me to live here all together. Gonna make it safe and fun for kids to get around the town. Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Eric Budd, welcome to Sharing Boulder. Thanks for making time today to be on the podcast.
Well, thank you, Philip. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, great to have you. Maybe just take a minute to just introduce yourself and what you're all about.
Boy, well, I live in Boulder, lived here for almost 15 years, and have certainly gotten involved in a lot of local issues. Really, like, the short history for me is just really caring a lot about transportation issues, transportation safety, being able to bike around the city and feel, safe and feel like it should be a low stress thing that people should be able to get around their city without a car, and turning that into how we use our land, because those two things are very connected. If you want these close connected communities, well, you have to build your buildings and your schools and your grocery stores and all that to accommodate that. And then various other things I've worked on. Most people know I've been involved with Bedrooms Are for People and passing changes to our discriminatory occupancy limits in Boulder, as well as worked on the campaign to move our city elections to even years to get more people voting, supporting our libraries with the library district. Involved this year again as there are more city elections. And
great.
Yes, our work is not done.
Well, thank you for your service. I got to know you through the Bedrooms Are for People campaign. That was a really fun introduction to local politics. Do you own a car?
I used to own a car. Yeah. So I sold my car in 2014, I think it was. So it's coming up on 10 years without a car. And, for most of those years, I was just by myself, getting around by myself. And now I'm with my partner and our 2 kids. And we also, as a family, don't have a car and get around with a cargo bike or maybe 2 cargo bikes soon. So It's really great.
Well, Akane and I did an experiment where we went without a car for two plus years, and that's another conversation for another time. But yeah, I think I'd be curious to go through the guest list to see how many people don't own cars that have been on the podcast. But I always admire people who make a lifestyle choice out of that. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, it's definitely requires a commitment for sure.
Yeah, but it's worth it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, well, for the purposes of this conversation, you also write an annual voter's guide, and I've really enjoyed reading through those, and I've forwarded them to lots of friends, and thank you for putting those together. I know it takes a lot of work, a lot of research, and so I want to thank you for that. And then also, I just thought it'd be fun to get together and talk about the landscape of what our ballots are going to look like this year, and talk about what's going to be on the ballot, and just have some give and take about the ballots. So
yeah, I appreciate it. I've never really talked about any of this stuff in audio form, so I hope people appreciate that.
Cool. Well, I wanted to start off by just kind of a little high-level commentary about just voting in Colorado in general, and like how wonderful it is. Like, I used to just dread voting because, you show up at the voter's booth, it's a Tuesday night, you're trying to get there before the booth, the polling station closes.
And where was that?
And well, the last time I remember voting in person was at the Mennonite church near Table Mesa and Broadway. And I also remember that moment feeling like I'm a fraud because I don't even know what I'm walking into. Like, I haven't read any of the ballot measures. I don't know who the candidates are. I'm just walking into a booth and just sort of rolling the dice and going with gut and sign name recognition. It's just a totally sad state of affairs and going on in my brain. And this is, I've been in Boulder, voting in Boulder since 2007. So it's not really ancient history that I used to vote like that. And I just really, I know you're not responsible probably for mail-in ballots, but I just want to do a shout out to whoever put this together. I'm sure it was really hard work, an uphill battle, and it wasn't probably intuitive to the people who were against it, right? That this would be a good thing.
And it's relatively recent in Colorado, as we have transitioned to all mail-in elections like ours, and a few other states in the country have this, it's actually not that common. Washington, Oregon, I think Utah as well. But I think those are the only states that really have all mail-in elections where everyone who's registered gets a ballot and it's mailed to their voter address. And I think people, once they really experience this, they sing the praises. And it was instituted, my understanding, if I recall correctly, that 2014 was the first all mail-in ballot election in Colorado. And I think you really can't find anyone in Colorado who thinks we should do it differently at this point. Not anyone serious.
Yeah, it's amazing because where I used to dread it and I felt like a fraud, now it's like I really get excited about voting. It comes in the mail, I open it up, I spend time with it, and then you're there with all your tabs open and maybe I feel like this year I'll probably be more prepared than I have in previous years, and it's a shorter ballot. But no, I just want to do a shout out to mail-in voting.
It's a big deal.
Before we dive in too deep. So I think the goal is to go through the ballot measures.
Yeah.
And let's start with the two state ones.
Yeah, I'd love to just talk a little bit about why I started doing this voter guide.
Oh, yeah, of course. Yeah, please.
Because it really parlays off of why you like mail-in voting. And I think the great thing about mail-in voting is your ballot gets mailed out roughly 3 weeks before the election. So, we're all busy people. We aren't necessarily paying attention to things all the time or all year round. And that period where you have a ballot, it's there, the election's coming up, and that period allows you to do your research. There are some things, of course, you're going to see them right away and you know how you'll be voting. And there are some things where you might take a full 3 weeks to really figure out, what do I think about this? Or who are these candidates that I won't want to vote for out of a set of them? And I need to research all of them. And so you're right, it completely changes the game from walking into a voting booth and maybe not knowing what's on your ballot until you see it for the first time.
Yeah. In fact, I often just didn't fill the whole thing out because BVSD school board, like I'm not paying attention to that in 2007 or whenever,
Right.
you know.
Yeah, and so like I think there is there is kind of a human habit of a completionist thing of where sometimes certain voters get chastised for not voting the whole ballot, or younger voters and say that, oh, they're too lazy. Or it's like, no, that's not it at all. Actually, most people want to vote on things. They take it as a privilege to vote on things, but they just don't necessarily feel like they know enough about every individual candidate or every individual measure to make an informed vote. So they will undervote on those things. Yeah. And that's really a lot of the reason that I started putting the voter guide out there. And the first time I did it was in 2016. I think I was pretty amped up for the election that year because of all the reasons of who was on the ballot, Hillary versus Trump, as well as like probably the biggest thing for me was just the way I like to approach these issues in general. Like always since I was a kid, I wanted to fully understand everything. Like even when we did group projects and whatnot, I wanted to tear everything apart. I wanted to write it all down and put all my sources out there and then go through it and make a decision.
You were a good student? That's hard to believe.
No, I wasn't. I was not very good at group work because I didn't want to let other people do the work. I wanted to like make sure I understood how everything worked. And obviously that there are pros and cons to that, but I've just carried that forward of like, I do want to understand intimately everything that's on the ballot. And I said to myself, well, okay, it takes me hours and hours to do this research and lay it all out. Why not just write it down and share it? And the other thing that really relates to that is that something I learned in college, little tangent. I was in a theater class where we had to watch a theater production and we had to write our opinions about it. And one of the things I took from this experience was, I watched a play that was at the local university across the street in Kansas City. And I watched it and I was like, I don't know, it's decent enough. It seemed like it was, well done enough. I enjoyed it enough, whatnot. And then when I went down and kind of we had to write a critique of this play. I really realized that there were a lot of things about it that I thought were, not very well done. And things that the added level of thought and detail it requires you to make to not just think about something, but actually write it down, sort of teach it in a way. Teaching is kind of a learning experience for the teacher as well. And so I thought that, well, this is great for me because I can really put down my thoughts in a way that I think is very defensible. And by the time I'm finished writing something, I know that I will have thought through it, every angle of it, and I need to be accountable to whoever I'm writing to. And so all of these things together, a lot of it came from my own self-interest, and I realized, well, I've got all of this stuff. I've got my opinions. I think they're well-researched. I include a lot of sources, so why not just start sharing it? Because I know other people would probably like and appreciate the same thing.
I totally relate to this in the sense of this podcast, right? Like, early on people ask, is anybody listening to this? And for me, it was sort of like, I don't even care. I get to interview interesting people, right. And I'm like trying to get better at it. And it's like, it's good for me. Like I really enjoy doing it. So it's sort of like, it's beside the point, Obviously I want people to listen and I want to like have a style and a format that is inviting and engages people in the dialogues going on around the city. But no, I appreciate that. It starts from a place of like, I want to understand how things work, and I want to be part of dialogue and conversation, and I want to understand who's who and how things work in the city. And the podcasting felt like a fit for me that works for me. And I think it's super cool that you write up your voter guide.
Yeah, thanks.
And I wonder, have you read through the 2016 edition recently to remember what it was like, and how do you feel about it when you go back?
I think I did. It was maybe last year or the year before. I kind of went back to my first one or two. And I think the thing that I found a little shocking was some of the ballot questions that maybe I wasn't as interested in. I just wrote maybe a couple sentences and then moved on. So I think I try to give like a minimum level of diligence on every item on the ballot. And I think that the standard I've kind of raised on that is like, well, link to all the sources about, the generation of this issue that we're voting on, and try to just include various resources. So at least if I am not writing that much on it, I'm sending people the resources of other people who have written more extensively as well. So so like on your ballot in the city of Boulder, when you'll get it, the first thing will be candidates. So there'll be candidates for city council, mayor, school board. I think we mentioned just talking about issues first, and then maybe we can talk about candidates later. Yeah, because I think the heart of what I see the work in my voter guide is about issues, because candidates are tricky for various reasons. Candidates put things on their websites. They all sound the same. They sound very pleasing and acceptable. But I think issues at some level, you can really analyze what an issue is going to do if it passes, what happens if it fails, why does it matter, the context, all of these things, I think, which is just a bit more rich. And I think it's, obviously there's opinion either way, but
when you
it's
say
a bit
issues,
easier.
do you mean couched in the context of how to choose candidates, or are you talking about?
I'm sorry, talking about the
ballot
actual
issues?
ballot issues in this case.
Okay,
yeah.
okay.
As in, like, it's a bit more concrete. Like, we all vote for candidates hoping that they are going to do these things that we understand for them. But issues just are a bit more like, there's laws involved.
Are we going to keep this tax or get rid of it?
Yeah, I mean, taxing and financial is kind of the biggest one of, like,
part of it.
They're pretty clear effects from things being passed usually.
Yeah.
There are on the ballot. I've got my notes here. If you're voting in the city of Boulder again, there will be 7 issues on the ballot this year. There will be 2 statewide issues. There will be 2 county issues and 3 city issues. And I think, as you mentioned, compared to years past, this definitely is a shorter ballot, fewer items on it, and maybe ones that are less complicated, at least in general. We can kind of talk about the particulars, but overall, most people know that even years tend to have more ballot issues and more things to vote on. And I'm a little bit thankful that this year is a little bit lighter, because I think when I did my voter guide for 2022, it took me, 15 to 18 hours total to put everything together, link it out, put in the graphics, and send it out. And I haven't finished writing everything up yet at this point for this year, but
you're kind of read up on
substantially
most of it,
less than that.
Good.
Yeah. So the first issue on the ballot this year is Proposition HH, which some people may have heard about already. It's been pretty well publicized. First of all, I try not to make assumptions about anyone, and that's like one of the things I think is really important in doing a voter guide, is that providing the context, providing kind of all the information that's relevant. And I think, like, some people know a lot about this, and some people are, again, seeing it for the first time. But essentially, this issue Prop HH it's about a number of things. But I think that the main things that it's about are property taxes, largely as it relates to increases in home valuations and how that's greatly increased taxes on those homes and businesses, as well as some other features about this measure that I think are really helpful policies that are not directly related to property taxes, but directly related to the state of Colorado budget. And that really involves how we fund our schools, how we fund our cities, our water districts, our fire protection, local governments, because these all have relationships with the state property tax. Many people may know that the city of Boulder funds a lot of their budget from sales tax, but a lot of counties and part of the city budgets are reliant on property tax. So changing, the rates or how things are set at the state level does have an impact on local governments. And there's also other pieces in here, like around funding for rental assistance for people. It's a pretty small part of the bill, but also, at least notable. And also things that just don't necessarily show up in the ballot language are how it would fund schools and how things are really constrained from state budgets.
So you've been talking about it now for like 2 minutes, and you haven't said what it is yet. And
Okay, yeah.
So it actually this is actually my difficulty with it, is I start reading it and I'm like, okay, there's this thing and there's this thing, and like it doesn't seem like a coherent ballot measure. It seems like it's kind of all over the map. Like it's going to reduce property taxes and increased overflow that they can keep based on Tabor. And I don't know, it feels like one of these things where it's like, I'm cynical. It makes me cynical. And I'm not saying that the people who put the ballot measure together, but it feels like it's like some kind of crazy workaround Tabor somehow, because Tabor always ends up being at the middle of everything. And but it also feels like kind of, I keep thinking that we ought to be encouraging higher property taxes from a progressive taxation point of view. And it seems like we're still like saying, hey, we want to lower your property taxes. And I'm kind of like, what's that about?
Yeah, and I agree. And I guess I should have said this at the beginning. Like, I think this ballot issue is actually the hardest, most complex issue on the entire ballot. And that we're starting with this one. So I think everything you're saying is true. And the other context of this, I'm just going to try to talk about like all the context for this. And you mentioned some of it. But this measure was put on the ballot by the state legislature. And there is a bill that was passed from the legislature that does outline all of these details. So really what we're reading...
Is it bipartisan?
No.
No, yeah. It's okay. We have a supermajority in both houses.
That is correct. So yeah, this was a bill put on by the Democratic legislature, essentially. But the bill does outline all of these details. So when you're reading it as a voter, you're just going by the handful of words that they put in the summary of this.
Yeah.
But the details are incredibly complicated, frankly. And this is one case where the Colorado Blue Book, which I'll definitely link in my voter guide, is extremely useful. It goes through all of these graphs of changes in revenue. So property tax will slightly decrease, whereas funding for schools over the balance of this 10-year period that this bill would be in effect would be able to rise, greater than Tabor. And Tabor, we haven't explained yet, Tabor is in the Colorado Constitution, which is what it stands for is Taxpayers' Bill of Rights is Tabor. And if you ever talk about state budgeting, Tabor is always a factor. Yeah. And part of the reason for that is that Tabor requires certain things about how the budget is set up. And also, it requires that we vote on new taxes or even renewing existing taxes. So it's really influential in why we're having to vote on this at all. And I'd say there's some pieces of Tabor that are useful, and I think...
I like the part about voting for new taxes. I'm not crazy about all the other stuff I hear about it in terms of constraints on what you can do, and I don't know, it's...
Yeah. I think like that's probably one of the benefits. And then there are a lot of negatives, I think, that just make operating a state budget very tricky. And actually, we'll talk about this in the next Prop II.
Okay.
We'll save that conversation, but that is also about Tabor, largely. Okay. So going to my notes about Prop HH, because you really don't want to go into voting on this measure without looking at your notes and without looking at something to really understand what it does, frankly. But I think some important pieces about this measure are up to $20 million a year in rental assistance that would be statewide, which is not a lot of money, but I think in this environment, having another funding source to keep people housed is useful. I mentioned the Tabor cap on education funding really relates to this measure in that this will increase the cap for education specifically. So we'll reimburse local governments under this. And this is something that a lot of education advocates have been hoping for a long time, is finding additional ways to use tax revenue to help fund our schools, because funding for schools in Colorado it's less than our comparable states, and we have very few mechanisms to actually change that.
Yeah, we're well into the 40s in terms of like funding per pupil.
Right.
If I remember some of the rankings that I've seen in terms of how well Colorado does.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he talks about some other pieces of it. I think that the property tax refunds themselves are a bit more progressive than just a straight cut. And when I say progressive, I mean in the sense of taxation, meaning if you have a property that's worth $100,000, for example, you'll get $167 back to $177 roughly, versus if you have a property that's $1 million, which is 10x, it's not 10x. It's about 208 to 400. Okay. So
Yeah.
even if you make the argument, which I agree with, that property taxes should not decrease, the benefits are actually going more to people and businesses that are on the lower end of the property scale. So if we're going to do this, that's actually a reasonable way to do it.
You're for the measure, I assume.
Yeah. We haven't gotten to that, but that is true. And I'll talk about some of the reasons why. So there's a one-time piece of this as well, which is the whole mechanism that they're using to essentially pay for this property tax decrease and the additional funding for education and rental assistance, et cetera, is backfilling from what's typically known as a Tabor refund. And that Tabor refund is largely, if not exclusively, funded from income taxes that are essentially taken in above the cap that Tabor sets. So the state is allowed to take in a certain amount of revenue, and anything over that, the state is required to do something with it. Well, refund it, yes. And so that's actually what the next measure is about, because the state can't simply keep the money without citizens basically voting on it and saying that the state can use the money. And so for 2023, there is going to be a change as well on the Tabor refunds. So this is a piece that probably benefits low income folks the most, which is Tabor refunds are normally taking that whole pot of money for the state, and they will give it back to people based on income tax
proportionally
bracket.
to how much they gave in.
Exactly, based on income, And so normally there are 5 brackets for that, meaning, if you make, let's see, what are these?
They're different income brackets.
Yeah, essentially the midpoint is about $100,000 a year. So, but they're different brackets. So you would have, if you're making less than that, you would get, a percentage of that, like as low as like 628 was looked at for like the lower end of the scale, versus if you were making over $278,000 a year, you were projected to get $2,000 back. And so for the 2023 tax filing that people will be doing starting next year, if this passes, it will be just a flat return of tax money, which is, again, thinking about progressive policy, essentially taxing higher income earners more, not more rate, but just more money, and then redistributing that to lower income earners is a progressive policy.
Yeah.
And so that would go into effect just for 2023 tax year, but still, I think, a benefit to people who are at the lower end of the income scale. And so you could certainly make a case, well, why don't we just do that all the time? Unfortunately, that's not what was proposed, but I think overall, I think is a good progressive policy.
And these are like mechanisms that kick in under certain circumstances, right? Like there's not always a refund.
That's correct. Yeah. And this is all going from the projection that the state is saying. And I think it's a pretty sure bet that we will make these numbers for next year. But then this bill that we're talking about has a 10-year lifetime, meaning it sunsets after 10 years. And so as you go each year out into the future, the projections are, of course, more and more potentially variable.
What is the sunset for? Is it because you never know? Like maybe we find ourselves, 10 years from now, we're like, oh, this never worked the way we thought it would, and now there's this big political battle. Or what's the actual thinking of the lawmakers who put the sunset in there?
That's a good question. I haven't researched enough to know like kind of what people have said about this. My presumption is that you and I and a lot of people think that Colorado's in a housing crisis. We've had a lot of influx in people, and we've had housing that hasn't kept up, along with kind of the U.S. housing crunch of housing prices generally rising all over the U.S. and obviously interest rates going up. I think there's a lot of near-term crunch. We've had a lot of valuation increase, so a lot of the benefits are really over the short term.
It is driven by current market conditions, which may be completely different 10 years from now.
Right, and so
Gotcha.
I think that's a lot of it. I think like we're acknowledging too that like this is taking revenue from income taxes essentially to backfill property tax loss. So 10 years from now, it may make more sense to let this lapse under the assumption that valuations are not going to continue accelerating at this pace that we've seen. So let's let this lapse, or at that time maybe pass a different policy so that we're not locked into this forever. my presumption is that's largely where the idea is coming from.
Well, I guess I can say I'm glad we're not using sales tax to backfill a
Yeah.
property tax, But income, I guess that's probably better than sales tax. But
Yeah, so I think like part of the reasons to talk about like why I support this or why this has been a pressing issue, I think as much challenges as I have with a property tax cut at all, I think acknowledging that the very steep increases in property taxes is a hardship both for homeowners and for renters who are, those taxes are largely getting passed on to renters, as well as there's a constant threat at the state level of Republicans and right-leaning groups, which are essentially pushing for a property tax cut without any of these benefits.
Gotcha.
There's a measure already being prepared for 2024 that is just going to put essentially there's a couple different measures, but the one that would be the most damaging is a measure that's been proposed to limit property tax increases to, I think it's 3% a year, essentially. And this is very similar to what's been done in California with what's known as Prop 13, which essentially says the value of your house or your property can grow and grow and grow, but the tax burden will not. And so it creates all these perverse incentives of
Never sell your house.
growing the value of your property, never selling it because it's now an asset now that you own it.
Yeah.
And also every year not increasing additional amounts to our schools or our local governments or whatever is using that property valuation. And so I think part of the political motivation is to stem off a lot of this, these really bad effects from property tax cuts that could be permanently in our Constitution is essentially what that one of these versions of the measures wants to do.
So HH kind of takes some of the wind out of the sails of a move in that direction.
Yeah, and I think uses some of this money, I think, in more progressive ways that I've outlined. So,
Yeah, great.
Those are the reasons that I'm a yes on this. And I think you certainly could make this policy more progressive, but kind of given these various dynamics.
In the world we live in,
Yeah.
in the state of Colorado politics.
I think it makes sense. And so I'll be saying vote yes on this.
Cool. Thank you. So let's see. How long did we spend on that first one? I know they're not all.
That was the most involved one. I plan
know.
on not spending as much time on any other
that's
ballot
okay.
issue. So
That's okay. Yeah. So well, tell us about II.
I think
I haven't read anything about this
Okay.
one. I don't even know what this
I think
one is.
II is actually much easier, frankly. So Prop II, the second measure on the ballot from the statewide perspective, and we talked about Tabor quite a bit on that first issue. And the Prop II is essentially all about Tabor. And it's actually rehashing an issue that we all voted on in 2020. And that is, there was Proposition EE in 2020, which raised a tax on cigarettes that was going to be used for, I think, primarily school funding. And
Early education.
In this case, preschool. Yeah. I don't remember. I'd have to look up exactly how much that passed by. I think it was fairly significant. I think there was a pretty broad agreement on it. All Prop II is saying is when we set these ballot measures, we say we expect to raise X amount of money by them. That's the estimate. And then the state is essentially held to that. Whatever they estimate in good faith that they will raise, let's say $5 million a year or whatever it ends up being, anything over than that, they actually have to return to the voters, the taxpayers, because of Tabor. And what Prop II is doing is essentially saying, what if we ask the voters, if we can just keep any additional money raised by these taxes and not have to ask or whatnot about retaining that money for the purpose that we already told you and we all agreed that we should do.
And in this case, if when the tax is returned, it doesn't go back to cigarette buyers, citizens. It's not part of like a Tabor refund at the end of the year, is it? It ends
right.
up,
It doesn't go to the voters. In this case, it actually goes to the wholesalers, distributors, nicotine product distributors, et cetera. They're paying these taxes. So essentially, if you don't pass this, you're essentially saying, well, this tax that they all should be paying, anything else actually is just going to go back to the sellers of these products,
Yeah.
which is not a very compelling.
No, they're not. They're not like our poster child for favorite
Right.
business
Right.
industry, whatever.
Right.
And for me, I have an emotional attachment to a woman who runs a Head Start program here in Boulder County. So
Yeah.
it's like, when I think about nicotine sales versus the good people in her organization working so hard. That's an easy one for me. But
Yeah, I agree. I don't know how much more there is to say about this one other than, we gave the context for why it's happening and the reason it's happening with Tabor. And I think, from a policy perspective, it's pretty easy to figure out if people support this or not. And I imagine the vote margin on this is going to be even higher than
Very
the original
wide.
tax,
Yeah.
I would assume. So, yeah, so I'm definitely a yes on Prop II and don't really need to say much more about it.
that one was much shorter. We are on a roll now.
All right, so the next issue on the ballot is going to Boulder County issues.
Okay.
And so just giving a general overview, there are 2 taxes proposed by Boulder County. These were put on the ballot by the commissioners, which is a 3-member board of the governance of Boulder County. And these are both renewals of existing taxes. So from that perspective, typically a renewal of an existing tax is less controversial than passing an existing tax. So overall, I think these issues are good and important and likely to both pass. And I think that's a great thing. So I will just go into the first one.
Yeah, sure.
So the first one is Boulder County ballot issue 1A. And this is an open space sales and use tax extension. And a lot of people know that not only the city of Boulder has an open space fund, but also the county of Boulder has an open space fund.
Yep.
And it's used for very similar purposes, acquiring, improving, managing, and maintaining open space lands and other open space property interests. That's right from the ballot language. And I think in general, I haven't done an extensive analysis on where the county is on their kind of open space priorities. Most of these, when it comes to City of Boulder open space or county, they typically have a long-range plan that they're using to guide how they're using this money for maintenance, but also future expansions or future projects or whatnot. And so one place that people often talk about open space at this point is these programs have been around for 30, 40, 50 plus years, depending on where you're looking at. And what is the kind of existing need for making these investments? How much of it is acquisition versus maintenance or other uses and whatnot? I think that's a great question. This money is typically less used for acquisition at this point, especially at the city level. But I think there are definitely, as you do take more of the land and preserve it, that does typically mean that some of the existing parcels, may have increased in value, or if you want to get a very specific piece of land as opposed to general areas that are typically lower demand, it does require funds to do that may increase as the years increase. And so overall, I'm in favor of this measure. I think it's especially compared to the issue we're going to talk about next, which is about affordable housing. This tax, the sales tax, is 0.05% versus the housing sales tax we'll be talking about is 0.185%. So this is actually only about a little more than a fourth of the money that we're going to be talking about for housing. And so I think certainly a lot of people that live in Boulder and Boulder County, we do really value the open space that we have, and thinking about opportunities to preserve that and better use that.
I mean, we think of it as a really well-run program, right? That's provided real value to the county,
right?
And I feel like you'd have to be really upset about what they're doing with these assets and the responsibility of the fiscal management and all of that to be like, oh, this is horrible, and vote against it. But on the other hand, there's still, the contrarian in me is still kind of like, aren't we using sales tax, this regressive tax policy to improve people's, the property owners' home values. And I kind of wonder if there's ever going to be dialogue around kind of restructuring how we tax and who benefits from it,
Yeah, and I think it's a very fair question, because I think you can make an argument easily. We're both housing wonks. We talk about like buying up all this land and preserving it has greatly increased property value. So why aren't we doing any property tax for this? I don't think there's a single amount of open space that's directly funded by property tax. And I think it's a very fair question. I think the flip side on this is that when you think about the use and visitation, in general, kind of like allure of open space, it's not just for the people that live here.
Yep.
A lot of the statistics I see for visitors to Chautauqua, for example, which is in the city of Boulder, typically runs about a third of the users are city of Boulder residents, about a third are county residents, Boulder County, and then about a third just come from all over the place, either other parts in the Front Range, tourists, people just visiting and whatnot.
And I'm fine with taxing the crap out of tourists.
Well, yeah, and most people are,
to some
right?
extent,
And so, like, I think if you were maybe thinking about a mastermind of this sort of thing, that you would have part of the taxes for open space paid for by property owners and part of it paid by sales tax, and I think that'd be reasonable. I think it's almost entirely sales tax funded, so certainly a critique worth having. I do think the benefits definitely outweigh the detractors here, but yes, if I was trying to put in a policy in place, I would probably have some sort of a split.
Cool.
So yes, I support extending the open space tax, 1A.
We're supporting all the way down the line so far. The first three we've talked about.
Yep.
HHII.
Yeah, and I think it is notable, like these measures that have been put on. There's two ways to get something on the ballot, which is either by the legislative body or by a citizen initiative, and Colorado is pretty good about putting things on at all levels of the ballot. And so these have all been put on by a legislative body. So the next issue on the ballot is Boulder County ballot issue 1B, which is the affordable and attainable sales and use tax. And so one thing that that is still a work item for me, which is about the context of this, is that my understanding is that this is a renewal of a tax that was originally put in place for flood recovery in Boulder County, because 10 years ago we had a historic rain event and flooding event, which at the time people said was so extensive that it's going to take us 5 or 10 years to fully recover from this, meaning all the damage to roads and trails and infrastructure and all of that sort of thing. And so I think that the genesis of this tax and renewing this tax is really around, like, this tax was set to expire. Can't remember if it's set to expire this year or next year. I think it's this year. And so essentially, what are the critical needs in Boulder County? I gave a lot of credit to our county commissioners for identifying as a key funding need, which is essentially what this would be used for, just reading from the measure as well. Funding affordable and attainable housing, related support services, including but not limited to development, operation, acquisition, preservation, renovation, maintenance, and construction of for sale and rental homes for low and moderate incomes and the local workforce, supportive housing, et cetera. And I think, like, I'm really excited that this is being proposed. My understanding is that this is the first affordable housing funding that the county has ever asked or put into place. And so, again, thinking about the context of this, who this money would be going to, essentially, it says grants to housing authorities, nonprofit affordable housing providers, and local municipalities. And those are really the entities that are in charge of building or helping the production of affordable housing in our communities. And the context of that is, like, the city of Boulder has a pretty useful and substantial affordable housing fund, and that's largely generated by new development, meaning if you want to build 100 units of housing, we say that at least 25% of that has to be permanently affordable. And then the question is, what happens next? So either a developer builds that on site, which doesn't happen very often.
A fourth of the homes are affordable at the site.
Right, which that's great if it happens, but
It never does.
not never, but usually not.
The rentals, there's a fair bit.
Yeah. As far as for sale housing, it's definitely not as much. And then the question is, okay, so let's say you're a developer and you decide not to build those units on site, but you pay 25% in. And for a typical housing development in Boulder, that could be hundreds of thousands of dollars into the millions of dollars that is set aside specifically for affordable housing.
Yep.
And so the really great thing about this ballot measure is you take that money that's paid in by the city of Boulder, and then you think about how can the city best get the most number of housing units out of this. And this measure, if it goes into place, ballot measure 1B, as well as a measure at the statewide level last year, Prop 123. Mm-hmm. So one fund from the state and then one potentially from the county, which can be used to match funds or provide funding for local governments to essentially take these sets of money and kind of get a multiplier effect on how much affordable housing they can build. And so I recently read in a local newspaper article that said when cash is paid in lieu of building affordable housing, that we typically get somewhere between 2 and 3 times the affordable housing built by matching it with these state grants or LIHTC, which is at the federal level. And now we're going to have potentially an additional way that we can match funds at the county level. There's a whole, set of challenges with building affordable housing that relate to zoning and land use and all that. And those are things that we continue to work on. But like providing these mechanisms to actually build the housing through a funding mechanism
having funding there
is huge. So yes, then the next piece is how can we change our zoning so that when we have the money, we can actually get the most out of it, build more transit-friendly, less car-heavy type of development. So I see this as kind of like part and parcel what's really important to help us get out of this affordable housing crisis.
Awesome. So you said it was 0.18%. I don't know what that translates into millions of dollars of per year. Does it say what the expected revenue is for that?
It actually doesn't. And oftentimes it will say it in the measure text itself. And so that's a research item for me.
All right.
At the county level, I would have to guess that it's going to be in the tens of millions of dollars a year at the county level, just off the cuff. Yeah. So I'll have an exact answer for you in my voter guide.
I was just curious. You had the notes in front of you, so I thought maybe you had it. All right, so we did the 2 state and the 2 county, and now we're on to our 3. We have a ballot measure and 2 ballot questions. Do you know the difference between a measure and a question?
Well, yeah, typically they're referred to as ballot issue or ballot question.
Oh, sorry, ballot issue or question. Yeah, not measure.
Yeah, and I can't recall.
Okay.
It's actually not obvious. I was wondering if it was related to whether or not it's a Tabor, but I don't think that's the case either.
Interesting.
We'll keep going though.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so City of Boulder ballot issue 2A. This one is a sales use and tax extension. And the history of this one is that there was a current funding mechanism for the City of Boulder that goes in the general fund to provide funding for various services. I'll just list some things: fire, emergency response, public safety, human services, homelessness, parks, etc., which is not the only funding mechanism, but this is essentially one of them. And this measure is due to expire in 2024. And another thing that happened in this past year is that there's a group of people who have been working for many years to try to provide additional funding for the arts specifically. And arts funding in the City of Boulder has historically been very low. I think we have a lot of natural beauty. We spend a lot of money on open space and various other things, but arts has not typically been at the highest level of the list. And so this group of folks essentially said, well, this tax renewal is coming up. Why don't we put a measure on the ballot to take this tax renewal that the city is using and direct it solely to the arts? And the total amount of money that this entire tax would generate is about $7 million. And so that would essentially, if that measure had just gone through fully, then the city would have had to reduce their budgets by roughly $7 million a year for those other things I mentioned, which are critical services, and then dedicate this solely to the arts. And so City Council, seeing this kind of coming head on, decided they had several options that they could go forth here. The city could go...
So this measure that you're talking, this ballot issue is a direct response to the next one we're about to talk about?
Well, there's actually only one measure on the ballot, but I'll talk about that. So, so the city council basically had three paths that they could have taken. They could have said, okay, arts group, you can have your measure on the ballot. We'll have our measure on the ballot. We'll basically be fighting over this money. And the way that the city charter handles this is that because they're conflicting, whichever one got more votes in favor, or assuming they both passed, whichever one got more votes in favor, then that would be the one that would prevail. Yeah. And so obviously this sets up like this very risky proposition for both sides, right?
Right.
And so, that wasn't something that anyone wanted. So another option that could have happened earlier this year is the arts group could have said, well, let's not try to go after this existing money. Let's pass a new tax just for the arts. But obviously they didn't make that choice. I think they maybe wanted to drive towards an outcome like this. The reason that a group might not want to do that is then it's the whole idea of passing a new tax versus renewing an existing tax. And people are so much more willing to renew an existing tax than pass a new tax. They didn't want to take that route. And so given that we're in this potential head-to-head scenario, the city council negotiated with this group and determined that a compromise is essentially the best path forward.
Okay.
And of course, there are trade-offs for this. That means less potential money going to the arts, and also the city essentially has to change their budgeting to have a reduction in future years.
So they're taking that $7 million and kind of splitting it down the middle? Is that half of it to the arts, half of it to what it was going to before? Is that?
I think that's generally true. There are a few more details that I want to research exactly, because I think it is important to note that starting since 2015, the city of Boulder has been increasing the arts spending in their budget. So there's already a line item, I don't remember exactly, it's maybe $1 or $1.5 million, just off the top of my head, that currently goes to the arts. And so what may happen is that with this new dedicated tax that would go straight to the arts, that existing funding may be reduced. But I know that some people didn't want that, so I need to do a little more research to see exactly how that would play in. But I think there's also been a discussion about, do we want dedicated taxes or do we prefer not to have dedicated taxes? And I think there's a good argument to be made that dedicated taxes are not ideal because we want to adjust to the priorities as they happen. Like if we have things that happen in our economy or shifts in the city where we need to shift money in the general fund from one thing to another, that a dedicated tax is not ideal. Flip side, of course, is that, well, without a dedicated tax for the arts, you can just cut the arts, cut it, and keep cutting it until you don't have a significant amount of money going to it. But then, of course, the question is like, where else are you going to cut? And we always have to make these choices. So I think that's kind of the full context of like where this measure came from and what it would do, essentially. The actual art spending would be extremely similar to how we do this currently, which is largely grant-based, meaning groups or individuals can apply for funding, and it's a kind of a...
Here's this pot of money. Here's what we're doing for grants this year. It's kind of like they do like a request for proposals or something.
Right, exactly. And so, that would just be continued, and the funding for that system would be increased. I think this is a reasonable compromise. And going back to the sales tax versus property tax idea, I also agree that I would like to see additional funding for the city be more property tax based, which is more stable. It's typically more progressive than sales taxes. And you can make the case that actually having a sales tax to fund the arts is reasonable because you're going to potentially draw people into our community that would not otherwise be coming to our community, and that there's kind of a multiplier effect in these taxes. When you put it into the economy through like additional productions or whatnot, then that tends to actually come back to the city through increased spending, which is again taxed at a low rate and comes back into the city coffers. So
I just had a brainstorm. One of my biggest complaints about the Safeway here. We're at Park East Park, so there's a Safeway less than half a mile from here. And every now and then, I don't know if you've ever been over there when there's a musician playing in the parking lot. There's no place for them to stand, you know.
Yeah,
and I
sure.
wonder. It seems like a great grant proposal that I would love to put a rubber stamp on would be like, hey, let's make a little space here for these wonderful musicians to come actually be welcome and to have a place to stand and perform.
Yeah,
Anyways.
for sure.
I mean, I've got all kinds of ideas of how to change the asphalt that sits fallow over there year after year. But
Yeah, just got to convince the property owner to do that.
Yeah, okay.
So, given where this measure stands, like I think my personal preference would have been a slight increase in sales tax to pay for this or a compromise, but that's not the direction that the council went with this. But given that, I think this is a reasonable compromise. I personally think the additional art spending is important for Boulder, especially as it relates to diversity and bringing more people to Boulder that wouldn't otherwise.
Yeah. What else we got left? We got 2 more ballot questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
City of Boulder ballot question 2B. Out of all the things on the city ballot, this one is probably talked about the least because it's perhaps the most boring. The reason is because it says the description, elections, administrative, charter, cleanup.
Okay, yeah.
And honestly, this is one of those things where you read it and it sounds like it's an administrative thing. It sounds like, well, why don't they just do this? And the reason this has to be put to the voters is that anything related to election law has to be passed by the voters. It's good that our city officials can't change election laws, and this is just one of those things that they have to ask us. Well, you can imagine
if they didn't have to, it wouldn't be so boring.
Right.
They might be like, hey, let's do something. We can do whatever we want, so let's do what we want to.
Right. And so to just give a brief description of what these are, it's related to citizen petitions. And, as someone involved in Bedrooms Are for People and you as well, like,
This actually matters.
This actually, hits home to me because it relates to the amount of time before so when you determine when a petition is due to go on the ballot for any particular year. So like the election this year is November 7th. Essentially what the charter currently says is if you want to submit something for the ballot this year as a citizen petition, you have to submit it no later than 150 days before. Yep. And right now that's about June 5th, roughly. And so the reason that's covered under election law is because you need to have strict, guidelines and strict laws about saying when these things are due so that there's no question about whether or not groups make the threshold.
Heaven forbid you would show up with your 3,000 signatures.
Right. It's like
at the deadline you were told.
Putting hundreds of hours into work to get something on a ballot and being told that no, you can't. Look at Bedrooms Are for People in 2020. This is related to exactly this issue. But really what the city is asking for is just a 10-day extension. They want 10 more days to process the ballots. They want some changes into the exact rules around this, remove the requirement that signers to petitions appear personally before the clerk. We can do these things more digitally these days. Clarify the state law. State law governs for process for charter amendments. That's actually exactly what Bedrooms Are for People was suing over in 2020, because we said that the city law should apply, and the city was saying the state law should apply, and it simply wasn't clear. So that's really useful. I'll write about that more when I write this up.
Oh man.
Overall, I think this is a pretty benign change, and it's reasonable for the city to want to do this, and it doesn't put any additional constraints really on the citizens because the actual amount of days you have to collect signatures to get something on the ballot is the same. It's 180. So what this means is if you're trying to get something on the ballot, you just need to start 10 days earlier.
Yeah.
So again, not a significant change.
Can I just ask a barely related question?
Yeah.
How's the electronic petition system going?
You don't want to ask me that question now.
Like no time for that now. It's a separate conversation.
I mean, that's a whole separate ball of wax.
Well is kind of what
I'd
I
say
read into your initial.
It's not great.
Yeah.
The biggest change that they made was to allow both online signatures and paper signatures, which I think in an ideal world, more people would use the online system. But, as long as there's incentives to keep improving the online system, hopefully we can actually get it to a place where it's the standard.
Yeah.
But, the next issue we're going to talk about, the safe zones measure, I was tracking their petition progress quite a bit. And I think they only got about 10% of their signatures online, and the rest they got on paper. So if you just hear that statistic, you'd say, well, that's not going that great. They should have gotten way more signatures online, right? But
not super easy.
So anyway, I'm a yes on City of Boulder ballot question 2B.
Okay, I am too. So it's we have one more ballot issue. So I think here's the deal. I mean, I'm wondering
if we can talk about.
I've interviewed nearly every candidate. So like people listening to the podcast, they can. And then we also interviewed Katie and Doug for safe zones, solutions, not safe zones. And then Terry Bernchich was also on the podcast. But I mean, I'm still happy to do a quick touch on that.
I think we should talk about safe zones. Okay, so City of Boulder ballot issue 302. So we said that the other two City of Boulder measures, those are both put on by the City Council. They essentially had to have a majority of people on council to vote in favor. Those are on the ballot. Safe zones is a citizen position, and this is one that was put on by a group of people that was essentially, they started on this in March, I think, and by June they got the signatures that they needed, and this is on the ballot. And what this does, it's called Safe Zones for Kids, and it's trying to put a policy in place on how the City of Boulder enforces their camping ban around unhoused people or people, sleeping in public space. And so it's written to say essentially that, prioritizing the removal of prohibited items such as tents, temporary structures, or propane tanks. And it says within 500 feet of a school or 50 feet of a multi-use path or sidewalk. And I think the big challenge with this for me is that I really have a fundamental issue with enforcing bans that essentially are to police homelessness on people when they don't have a sufficient place to go. And full disclosure, I'm part of the City of Boulder, the lawsuit against the City of Boulder by the ACLU is essentially arguing this exact same thing.
Yeah.
And what I think this policy does is it really takes what is largely current policy where the police is doing their own prioritizations, and it's putting some extra restrictions on it. It's actually putting it into the law as opposed to being a policy that's just determined internally.
Yeah.
And I just simply, I don't see a benefit in this. And you can make an argument about whether or not the current policy is working or useful or whatnot. But essentially, it's trying to hold the city to these specifications, and it's putting it in law, which then essentially makes it difficult for the council to change, and also could really inspire lawsuits saying, well, the city is not adequately doing their job, essentially.
There's no signage near my sidewalk.
Right. I mean, and the idea that they put within 50 feet of any multi-use path or sidewalk is just baffling to me. Why that should make sense as something that's...
Yeah, for me, I was kind of I was wanting to hear out the arguments to kind of, there's so much to be said about homelessness and about how to help people and what we should be doing as a city. And then I got reading the ballot language, and I was like, this is so, to me, it's really absurd, the whole 50 feet from a sidewalk. I have a sidewalk in front of my house,
right,
owned by the city. And so it's that's kind of just for me, that's where my brain just sort of shut off. It's anything other debate about it is sort of, it's important that we have healthy dialogue about these what should be done. But in terms of this ballot measure, for me, it's all right, I don't need to talk about it anymore.
Yeah, and I think that's the helpful context for people is that this was put on the ballot essentially, in my view, it is using kids fully as a political issue to get a conservative council elected.
Yeah.
And I think it's really inappropriate. It doesn't do anything positive, if this were to pass. If anything, it just makes it more constrictive, more difficult to actually, just let the police do their job. That's what the current policy is. And obviously we can talk about improving policy or changing policy, but that's not even what this does. It just locks in current policy even further.
Yeah.
And so this is a pretty easy no vote for me, but it's going to be contentious.
Yeah, we haven't done any real polling to know how these things. Actually, this brings up. Do you have anything else to say about safe zones?
I'm voting no.
Yeah.
I think that the thing is, like, it sounds very reasonable, but I think, like, this is part of the reason that I think voter guides are helpful to actually, show like write-ups about like why a certain policy is just not going to be helpful for us.
Yeah.
So yeah.
The barely related point that I was going to make is that one of the reasons that the city elections are so fun and exciting and anxiety-inducing is that we don't do any polling. We have no idea what's going to pass and what's not going to. I mean, some of the tax renewal stuff ends up winning by a landslide if you look at previous elections. But and we can make educated guesses about which candidates have a chance, but there's always surprises, and we don't really know until the votes are counted.
Yeah.
And that's pretty entertaining as far as television goes.
I agree. Yeah, the best resources are really like a whole separate thing that I do is like analyzing of elections and what happened. And I used to put more of that on my blog, actually, at the same place that I post the voter guides. But it's interesting because like there's always this trade-off of like, well, political strategy versus fully like explaining like what happened. But typically in these kind of elections, the best indicator are just data from other elections, related issues, voting patterns. And yeah, it's almost never polling, especially about candidates. Like no one really polls candidates in these local elections because most people don't even know who they are until they get their ballot and then they look them up.
Yep, that's totally. Well, Eric, thanks so much for making time for this and detailing. You, man, it's really like impressive how you can answer specific questions and understand the issues really well. So thank you for making time. And
absolutely.
I look forward to seeing the voter guide when it comes out, and I'll be forwarding it to my friends and neighbors. So
well, I really appreciate that.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
Gonna find me a residential pedestrian district where I can gracefully grow older. Gonna spend my remaining years sharing Boulder.
Thank you for listening to Sharing Boulder. Please support the podcast by sharing it with your friends and neighbors. You can contact me at linktree/Philip Ogren, which you can find by visiting sharingboulder.us, where you can also find show notes and previous episodes. This episode of Sharing Boulder was produced by Philip Ogren and edited by Katie Avery. The music was created by Nathaniel Ogren and Sack Lunch. Keep sharing, Boulder.